Send you the link. Oh, did you hear
Okay,
that?
got it. Cool.
Super. Sorry, hey, I didn't see your note about sending links. I didn't see that. So obviously
No, it's good.
you had to sleuth on your own.
No, oh, I did. We looked at some videos. This is creative director Rita Brain.
Hi, Rita.
She she's a painter and an artist too, and I'm excited about the show
Cool.
coming here. Um, so I thought we would, we did look and learn about Cirque Mechanique. Is that or Mechanic? Is that the proper
Mechanics. Mechanics. Yeah.
mechanics? Indeed, and that aspect of it, I see the way I read it, circus builder. So how would you describe that, on for a traveling show like this? Build the apparatus. Is that the main job?
Well, in terms of the show, the how I explain the show, how I describe the show.
Well,
Or
how would you describe your role with the show for
oh,
people?
well, um, I produce the show, I design and build the apparatus with a team of a friend of mine. And then co-direct the show collaboratively with four four other players. We've been working together now for almost 20 years. We did our first theatrical show called Birdhouse Factory together in 2004, and we've had the same creative team since then. And by creative team, I include the my scenic and rigging design partner, who Sean Riley, who was also my kind of collaborative partner on building these apparatus, designing these apparatus. Choreographer Aloysia Gavre, co-director, dramaturge Stephen Regatz, and composer Michael Picton. Um, and I would say that in terms of how the shows get created, it leans a little bit more heavily with myself, Riley, Aloysia, and Stephen. And then Michael, as the composer, comes into the project a little bit later. My role, once the show is up and running, is really just it shifts to more producer. And I hand over the reins on the artistic kind of the artistic control of the show to an artist in the show who's the coordinator on the project, who has been with us now since he was 18. So 20 years, he's 38 now. So he knows kind of what we're going for. He's part of all the creations as well as kind of an acrobatic captain. He comes from the world of trampoline. So my role, once the show's created, shifts to kind of more producer and managing the agent and all the fun stuff that is running a business, which is, of course, I'm being sarcastic.
Well, I hope this is part of the fun stuff too. It's really interesting to hear you talk on it, and the creative process is something that is so interesting, especially in foreign to most people kind of mediums as this. So does it basically from the pen and the pad all the way to the traveling show, like a 2 year process, kind of like not like
Yeah,
building a movie, but building a
yeah. Yeah, it's
this.
about a year. It's about a year and a half. And yes, it starts just like everything from the napkin drawing to then pretty quickly once we identify and let me back up a little bit in terms of the overall how it differs from theater is that we kind of write our shows backwards. So they begin with a central um, mechanical apparatus or idea or delivery mechanism or mechanical solution to a circus problem, like how do you lift an aerialist, how do you swing them out and get them closer to the audience, how do you transport a contortionist and turn them around so you can see the act in the most favorable light. These challenges become kind of jumping off points for the apparatus. And I'll back up a little bit. So when I started my career as a German wheel artist, and I'd roll around in this big 7 foot wheel and drop down like a coin and all of that. I realized pretty quickly that you need a fair amount of space for that. So I built a set of rollers so I could roll in that wheel in one location. And then later we realized, wow, it'd be cool if we could turn this into a big winch. So we connected a winch to the rollers. So when I'd spin in the wheel, the winch would lift and lower an aerialist. So this connectedness, this kind of visual, the way things work, like bringing the book, the way things work on stage and opening up the clockworks and letting people see exactly how the work, the business of the circus is done. How do we lift an airless? We make it part of the exchange and the visual is very much part of the show. We don't try to hide it. We kind of want to glamorize it because it's beautiful, and I think it adds a layer of the productions, which makes them a little bit more accessible to a wider swath of people. You have people like, mechanics and engineers and people that would like, work with their hands that are able to engage with it in a way that they might not if they just thought it was a show with a bunch of choreography and people doing dance or even theater, right? So in that way, and that's not it was not an intention other than it's what we think is cool, right? So that's the reason it's been successful. I think it's because we kind of really are driven by finding these solutions to these fun circus problems and then showcasing them. And so we start with an apparatus, and then we think about what that apparatus looks like. In the case of our new show, Zephyr, we decided we wanted to have a ground supported, and this is something that started about 10 years ago now. We were going in and out of theaters. We were hanging truss on chain motors and then guying them down so it didn't move around, which meant you need ground anchors in the floor and you need rigging points above. And we had developed an apparatus called the gantry bike, which was the 22-foot tall truss structure on wheels that can rotate and drive down the street and put airless on it. And we developed that for a festival and realized how cool it would be to be able to bring that onto a stage. For practical purposes, it means you don't need to go to the grid anymore. Everything's from the ground. So you can build from the ground up rather than going to the grid and hanging stuff down. It makes it a lot faster. It means you can go into a lot more venues. And so that became a design parameter. Okay, not only does it has to do this, this, and this, but this thing now has to be built on the ground. And so we wanted to create an aerial lift system that would allow us to kind of swing the aerialist around. And so we settled on a big a pillar, a pedestal. The idea was it was going to be a pedestal with an arm on the top that would pivot around. And that pedestal, so that we could spin all the way around, really meant that it had to be in the middle of the stage. So now we're faced with, okay, what does this thing look like? Well, it's essentially a big column. And we settled on a windmill, but initially it could have been, and typically what'll happen is I'd throw this into SketchUp, which is just a 3D rendering free software. It's kind of like I don't know, a less complicated version of Vectorworks or CAD. And we throw that pedestal in there with an I-beam across the top and an aerialist, and we throw skins on it. What could it look like? Well, it looks a little bit like, could be a guard tower for a prison, could have been a big swing pedestal, like the swing ride at Coney Island, could have been a lighthouse, could have been a sequoia tree, could have been a rocket ship, could have been, right? And so the windmill came. Really, it's been stuck in my head for 6 or 7 years. I went on a family trip, and a friend of ours who knows my penchant for an interest in these mechanical things brought us to a friend's windmill. And this guy, Nigel, mills flour for the best bakeries in London. It's about 3 hours north of London, a little town called Wissendale. And he still does it the old-fashioned way, right? And he's this kooky guy, all covered in. He opens the little door of this thing, and he's covered in white. He looks like a ghost. Big long beard. I mean, just this crazy guy. And so that struck me. And then we went inside this windmill, and there's big 10-foot wooden gear spinning around inches from your head. It's the most dangerous place I think I've ever been in my life. It was awesome. And so that kind of stuck in my head as wow, what a cool environment. My friend even joked at the time, maybe you could do a show at a windmill. And we were like, yeah, whatever. There's no, like that's weird. But it ended up triggering. And then what we do is we think about, okay, so how do we light on or decide on which device it's going to be? In the case of this, I was leaning towards Lighthouse, because I really like that. They're just kind of poetic and and what they suggest. And a windmill, for what it suggests, and we started to kind of look into wind, and there's the conversation about renewable energy, and we're not political per se, but I think the message we're really telling is, hey, it's a good idea to evaluate or reevaluate these things that in the past we just kind of kicked to the curb. We have windmills. They found proof of windmills that look like those in Holland, and in Spain from 2000 BC, right? So that's 4,000 years of wind power. And then like around the time of the Industrial Revolution, we said, nah, we can do better. And we threw it away. Um, and now, of course, we're kind of reevaluating that. And in our story, so getting back to that, we decided on the windmill. I thought it'd be cool because there's some possible narrative ideas. We like Nigel as a central character of this thing, this wacky windmill operator. And we like the idea we had pretty early on. And we have to be careful, right? Because we are writing a show that's going to be nonverbal, right? So the stories we are going to try to tell, we have to know we can pull it off, right? So we have to kind of be a little bit thoughtful about that rather than creating these scenarios where you suddenly need to have like, cue cards or something, right? So we thought, okay, we could demonstrate wind. We have a personified wind character in the show, and we have Nigel, and this personified wind and Nigel have a relationship, and we established that by they see each other, they interact, and the wind productively spins the windmill and helps Nigel do his thing. And then at some point, Nigel becomes frustrated with the wind, loses hope, and right at this moment, the slick salesman comes into town and sells Nigel on the idea of using a generator to power his production. And that works for a little while, and then it fails and falls apart, and he loses faith and then rediscovers and decides to kind of reconnect with the idea of using wind. It's a pretty simple story, but it's kind of rings true because it's something that humanity has kind of gone through really recently. So then we once we decide those parameters, then we start to cast, and we meanwhile are always thinking about what are the acts we haven't presented before, because we go back to the same theaters, every other year or so. So the shows have to be fresh, not just in art direction, which is the skin we put on it, right? The costuming and the choreography and the music and all that. But it's really the meat and potatoes of what the audience is going to see. Yes, how it's executed is going to be different, but we have to be mindful. So we start looking for other acts. And so early on in the process, once we know we have this pedestal in the middle of the stage, we start thinking, okay, physically now, what are the acts that can be performed either in front of that or around that? So we added a bicycle act or the aerial act that spins around it, or and then we start to identify people and players. And once we do that, Stephen, who's their kind of dramaturge and creative partner, starts to think about these ideas. And I had given him this, I'd worked on this synopsis of man's relationship to wind and man losing faith in wind and then rediscovering wind. And I sent that off to him, and often he's like kind of grumpily will be like, no, that's garbage, and he'll do something much better. So I expected him to kind of, push back a little bit, but he actually embraced the idea and came up with a really cool plot twist, which I won't tell you about, which is really, really great, made it so much better. And then he starts thinking about, okay, knowing that we're going to have these people, knowing who they are, what their skills are, we can lean on them to kind of be our storytellers, right? Because acrobats in general are not theater people. So again, we have to write for that. And which means that when we're casting, we really need two people who can give some kind of idea of what the story is through their ability to kind of be present and act, and not act as in terms of vocals, but even just physical presence and being and sending focus to somebody else. Acrobats don't have a lot of experience with that, so we have to cast a couple of people that we know we can lean on for that, right? And then the creative process, and all of that I just said starts about a year and a half in advance, and then about a year or 10 months in advance, we get the creative team together for kind of like a summit. We used to do it in person. Last time, I think we did it. We did both. We did a little bit remote. We did some in person because they're scattered. My graphic, scenic, and rigging partner Riley, who is the guy that we designed everything together. He lives in British Columbia. We do everything over Zoom, but I'll send him drawings. 3 o'clock in the morning, I'll be up and I'll just do this thing, and then I'll get up in the morning and he'll have like transformed it and made it better. And we go back and forth, and then about then we'll touch in again throughout the process, but then we get the artists here about 4 weeks before we open. We have the artists all together, so we only have a creation period of about 4 weeks in Las Vegas in our workshop, and that doesn't mean we don't start with them earlier. Some of them are in town, and so we'll start to create acts together with them. But some artists are we see something that we like. We've got their 5 minutes that we know we can plug in, and we bring them in, in that 3-week rehearsal period, a week before we go into the venue for tech, and we integrate the act. And so it's a kind of short period. It means that we have to have our ducks in a row. We need to be pretty organized to be able to make that work in that short amount of time. And I think that the reason it works is that those of us that conceive of the work, we build the work and produce the work, and so there's not a lot of this lack of communication between the scenic guy who builds the thing that suddenly can't fit in the theater, or a costume designer that builds a piece that doesn't doesn't work for the aerialist because they didn't know that they had to have the back of their legs, um, you know, skin or uncovered or something like that. So we sidestep a lot of those kind of pitfalls because all of us come from the performance world or intimately connected with it, rather than designers who come a little bit at it from a different angle.
Can you hear me? We just lost the audio. Can you hear me?
Oh, I
Oh, you're
can.
back. You're back though. We got all of that just at that last moment. Very well described. Can you hear me now? It's breaking a
Perfect.
bit. Oh,
Perfect.
okay, you're back there. Oh,
Yeah.
so all the way from pen to pad, and I think you had just got to the. I was curious about the music part. You know,
Yeah.
the composing. I play the piano a little bit, and I've interviewed
Cool.
video game composers before, and it's truly intriguing, and also movie soundtracks, of course. Is so that part comes after the casting, or I was curious if you have a band play with you,
Yeah.
or
Well, we
recorded music.
yeah, it's all recorded music. It's all original. And it varies at how early the composer gets involved, depending on what the project is and what he's doing. I'm extremely grateful because we've kind of grown up together. Um, our design team have gone on to do amazing things, and they're super talented people, and I get to have them on our projects because we're friends and because they like the creative freedom that they get as collaborators on our projects. Unlike when our composer goes to work for Ringling Brothers and does the composition for Ringling Brothers, it's got to fit in this neat little box, and it's got to be a certain thing, and they know pretty much what they want, and doesn't have as much freedom. So when he gets to work on our projects, he's able to kind of really um, be in a little bit more of a lead role in terms of what the soundscape's going to be for the show. I give input, but I really trust him. Once we tell him it's going to be a pastoral setting, and we want something that's evocative of like the 1930s, then he's off and running. And in terms of the process, because it is an interesting process, and you allude to the way a video game is scored or film is scored. And in some ways, the show and the acts are scored. In some ways, it's the other way around, right? So sometimes, and I know you know it, but the way you're nodding your head, I'm guessing you understand what I mean by that is that, of
I
course,
do.
they do a movie, they'll play the movie, and the composers will follow, and the musicians will follow along and record to the live thing that's happening. It'll be orchestrated on the spot, some on the during the playback and recorded. um and we do that, so we have a process whereby a few months before we're in the shop rehearsing, I'll get 3 or 4 or 5 temp tracks from the composer, and these are done without live. The music will eventually be recorded with live musicians, but early on it's all synth tracks, right? So they'll put together all these layers, and this is what I'm thinking about. What do you guys think? Do you like this? And we'd be like, that's really cool. We're rehearsing with the group act now. Let's just play that and see how it goes. So we might have the benefit of playing this piece of music during some rehearsals before we get together and identifying, yeah, that's going to be great. And then we'll send him videos of the rehearsals. And then he'll take that piece and he'll rearrange it to support the visuals. Um, Sometimes he'll create 4 or 5 pieces, and one piece he's creating because he's seen a video, and another piece he's creating just for the love of what he does and creating music that is interesting. And then he'll rearrange that piece, and not rearrange in terms of orchestration, but rearrange it in terms of the chunks, the building blocks to support an act that maybe starts in a more lyrical way and then has a big crescendo in the middle and then is more lyrical and then a little finish at the end. He can take those things and move them around in chunks. And I think it's a unique skill as a composer to be able to write in such a way that allows for that flexibility, to be able to kind of take this section over here and move it over here without being precious about it, because it's a balancing act. He needs to be protective of it because it's got to sound great. But we all, as a collaborative group, we all need to kind of recognize that we the nature of the beast, right? We all make concessions, and to the degree that we're successful, it's the combination of you got to fight for your thing, but you also have to try to have the big picture and understand that just because you want that thing here, there's some other things that are going on, and there's a reason why we can't have that really strong piece of audio for this piece, because right after in the show we're going to have this piece that's really soft, and so this piece really needs to be somehow not as similar.
Oh, indeed. And speaking of the big picture, that's quite the description from the napkin to all the way to the composing. It's producer, director, writer, and with the team that you have is putting on such a large scale thing from idea to finish. I'm glad you mentioned the book I'd forgotten that I grew up with, is How Things Work. It's his name of it. And I just wanted to come back to that for a minute because I truly remembered looking forward to the next page on what's inside the ocean liner or the space shuttle or things like that, the mechanics part, which I think we got if you got a few more minutes here, is we're an arts and culture magazine, but we're also here with Virginia Tech. Is a big part of Blacksburg town, huge, famous for engineering, built on engineering. So showing that the art of engineering seems like you do in a way that is separated from, people might not go to a theater or a ballet or something, but did I hear it right where you kind of show the mechanics, back to that engineering aspect of it?
Yeah, they become, I mean, they're part of the imagery, the kind of the imagery that we're trying to get across. They're part of it from the beginning, right? It's not a layer that's affected or put on. This, there's certain genres, right? There's like the steampunk genre, and
Yeah.
steampunk. We were doing our show Birdhouse Factory with the wheel, and it was set in a factory based on Diego Rivera's murals that he did for the Detroit Industry of Art in 29 or 30.
Yeah.
We brought those chunky murals to life, and we used those murals for the color palette, the mustards and the ochres, the choreography for this kind of chunky kind of, and so that was kind of a guiding principle for us. So somebody said to us a couple years later, "Oh, that's so steampunk," and we're like, "Steampunk?" This is like before that, when that word was just being kind of getting around. We're like, "Well, what is that?" And it was true that it was a bit steampunk, but what wasn't true is that steampunk, the way that most people see it now, is it's a lot of like, they'll glue a bunch of gears to the top of a top hat and suddenly it's steampunk. And so the difference there is that the mechanics that we display are really doing the thing. We're not faking it, right? There's nothing that we're doing that isn't real. And there are times when it would be easier to put a motor on it, or to do something that so this is the thing though, right? And this is the cool part about the mechanics, and why I think we're able to accomplish it successfully, right? Is that the engineering of the thing, the gear ratio of the thing. For instance, the gantry bike, which I have, which if you haven't seen it, it's on our website. There's a
It's
yeah.
amazing.
So that device has a climbing bicycle on it, right? And that bicycle, when you pedal it, it goes vertically, it climbs. Well, it's connected to a cable, and when you climb, the airless goes down, right? So this visual interplay, when you first do that in the show, when the first time we pedal it and the apparatus comes down, there's an audible ooh in the entire audience when that happens, right? And that's like the aha, right? And that's exactly, I mean, there's nothing for me, I'm not more proud of anything that we do than when that aha moment happens, than when and we see it every time. There'll be like a dad with his daughter or son, and this will happen, and you see them go like, you see that, and they're like drawing it out like you do in How Things Work, right? You're following the dotted line to see the thing going Rube Goldberg, like around the pulley and doing its thing. And sometimes we will make things that are less efficient because it's more visually interesting. But we always have to identify whether visually it's going to be understandable. For instance, what I mean about the bicycle is that we know we can mechanize. We all know, anybody with any engineering background knows you can mechanize anything. You can create a gear ratio that will allow you to. I could pedal and lift a 1-ton dump truck with my legs if I gear it appropriately. It's going to be boring as hell because it's going to take me, a half an hour to move it an inch, right? It's not interesting, right? I'm exaggerating, but visually it has to be understandable. And so even though you can do a thing doesn't mean you should do a thing. And sometimes you can do the thing and then visually you look at it and like, yeah, we're doing it. But unless you explain to people what just happened, they're not going to get it. So there's this balance as well. And that's part of the design process early on, is identifying that and being like, wow, we really thought we could tilt the thing by walking up the beam and that would show, but you have to move so slowly that it's not really going to read or whatever, So that's something that is part of that process. And the how things work absolutely is people see that, like we're not, and I don't have an artist on stage running around going like, look, everybody, follow this path. But we're guiding them, right? I mean, as theater people, we have other tools that we can employ to illustrate this relationship by just taking the lights down and making it so the only two things you see on stage is that bicycle climbing and that thing going down. And you don't even have to see the cable in between. You'll see it, but um, but we're not trying to hide that stuff. And we're really trying to kind of always evaluate whether it's we like it and think it's cool. Sometimes I have to check, I have to get an outside eye and be like, okay, look, I'm going to show you this thing and you tell me if you understand what's going on. And it sounds really simplistic, but sometimes visually we're so close to it, we don't really understand. We have in Zephyr, we wanted to create lift with a big counterweight system. So we have a wheel on one side that two guys are sitting in. We have the aerialist on the other side of this 22 foot, 20 foot tall, teeter totter. And the boys that are sitting in this wheel, they can lean forward and she goes down, and they can lean back and she goes up. And visually on stage, you can see that happen. Now, we could have, in the design, we needed to make sure that the wheel was far enough away from this structure of a windmill that we've scenically put on the front of this pedestal. Visually, that's cool, but we needed to make sure like it's on the front of the pedestal. But we need to see the mechanics. And do we want to turn it around and show the back of it? And so in the act, so that we can send that point home even more, we rotate the windmill around and you see the back side of it. And you see the mechanical thing happening even more clearly. So these are design parameters and kind of design, I don't know, directorial parameters, even when we're deciding what's the final show, how are we going to put the show together in terms of directing the stage movement. A lot of times we'll get feedback that will help inform those decisions about like, wow, okay, that's really cool, but that thing that you need to have on the face of the thing to show us that it's a windmill is now getting in the way visually. So how can we address that? And sometimes it's by turning the thing around, like we're able to do in Zephyr, because it's built, it's a big turntable, and this entire windmill can rotate. It also helps the fact that it rotates it helps the storytelling as well, because as storytellers, like my dramaturge, Stephen, will ask me, he'll say, okay, I know you're building this thing. Does it have the capacity to do this? Because he has an idea about, wow, if the first act, it's a working windmill, like in Holland, Man of La Mancha, and then we turn it around in the second act, it's a turbine. Well, there's some, that gives us some storytelling potential, that this big apparatus has the ability to convey a lot of information pretty quickly. And so this integration and this cohesive outcome is really a result of that level of engagement that happens from early on, because you just couldn't do it after the fact, right? If we design the thing and then he says, oh, I need this, and you're like, oh, well, we didn't know it needed to do that.
We got time for one more?
Yeah, of course.
Appreciate time. You got anything, Lisa?
No, this has been really great, and thank you so much for opening up about the creative process. This has really been fascinating.
Cool.
I couldn't agree more. I recalled, I think I rode a carnival ride called the Zephyr that spun around, with the swings there. And we were talking on, what does the windmill mean, and the Don Quixote sense, and she was talking about yodeling by it, and it just means, and all the way to the grindstone, which is a very, speaking of storytelling, as me as a writer, and telling it visually like that is working in those constraints at the same time to get across a very simple message that's very relevant in this time. And it's an amazing, it's going to be an amazing thing to witness, I believe. I really look forward to the show coming here. Is there anything? Oh, I had a kind of nuts and bolts question. Sounds funny, but I didn't mean it that way. Is that if when you show up to town, it's going to be in a month here, right? And so, do you guys like set up the day of? Would that be a good time to maybe grab some photographs, or during setup time, or is there a rehearsal perhaps where we could stay out of the day?
Yeah, so I don't know. I would have to look in Blacksburg. I'm guessing we're just in that morning. Blacksburg is the second week. Oh, that's a month. That's a load in on the 30th. Oh, so Blacksburg. So there's kind of two different scenarios in terms of load in. One scenario is we have a school show in the venue. And if we have a school show in the venue at 10 o'clock in the morning, we got to come in the night before. So we'll come in the day before. We'll do the build process, the tech through, and some rehearsals. Then the next day we come in, do a school show. Then we've got like a 4-hour chunk in between or whatever that is. If it's a non-union venue and the artists need to train, they can train on stage. If it's a union venue, you got to get the hell out and then come back an hour before doors for the second show and do the show. So in Blacksburg, we will be loading in the day before the show, whatever the show is advertised for, a Tuesday night or Wednesday night, whatever that is. And the best thing to do would be for you to, I will send you an email introduction to Rachel, who's our production stage manager, company manager, does it all, right? Because again, we're a very small team. And the way we're able to create the shows is the same way we're able to produce the shows, because we have the right people. And if we didn't, none of this could work, because everybody needs to wear 3 hats and do it willingly and embrace it and relish in it, or else, because we just can't. I mean, the arts, it's no secret, right? There's just not a lot of money to go around to make these things work, especially when you're touring something that, you got to pay the artists from the time that they're on site, from the time they go home. And that could be 3 or 4 or 5 weeks later. And increasingly, it's harder to get theaters on board to get 3 or 4 venues in a week to make the math work. So you got to have the right people. But I can connect you with Rachel if you would like to come in. I won't be in Blacksburg because I have to kind of be back here running the shop and, trying to figure out how to pay for some of the weeks on tour that don't pay for themselves. But that's the nature of the beast. I'm not complaining about that. It's just the nature of it, right? So I won't be there, but Rachel will be there and Wes would be there. So what I would do is I could send an email both to Wes and Rachel and say, hey, I did a talk with these guys and they want to come in, grab some pictures, maybe even talk to you guys and say hello, whatever. Because in Blacksburg, we have a load-in day and then the shows are the next day. It's a little bit more relaxed. The other normal, so the norm is actually our electrician, who's our master electrician, who's our lighting director. He shows up at 7 o'clock in the morning. He has an hour. Now the show should be pre-hung and circuited, all that stuff in advance. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. He shows up at 7. He gets in, does the focus of everything over stage, so that way at 8, when we come in with the windmill and everything else, we get to build it. Sometimes they're focusing up or down stage while we're building. By coffee, we're built. So the design parameters, not only on the art, on the creative side, but on the technical side, got to fit in a 26-foot truck, got to be built by 10 a.m. And the reason it's got to be built by 10 a.m. is because we need to give it back to lighting, because lighting needs another 2.5 hours to focus, fine tune, troubleshoot, and all that stuff. We get the artists on stage after lunch at 1, from 1 to 2:30 or 3. They've got spacing to do, right? To be able to rearrange. Oh, it's a little shallower. We need to come out sooner so we can be on time for that cue. Oh, there's no backstage crossover, so we need to figure out how we're going to get from left to right with those props, or is there time to go in the understage crossover to get there in time? All that happens during the artist spacing, and then we do tech through, which is basically a rehearsal for technicians. Artists sometimes run their act, sometimes they don't, depending on time and whether they want to or not. That's really for Rachel's stage management and technical team. Our shows are built in such a way we don't require any local crew cues, because it's impossible to have time to train or teach people these cues when you're and you don't know who you're going to get. You may get, Joe, the technical director's, stepson's brother's kid who's never even run a follow spot or whatever. So we run. I mean, It's actually not accurate about the follow spot because we'd have no choice over
I
that.
understand what you mean, though.
Yeah, yeah. So, we create the shows in such a way that we can rehearse them and tech them. So we need minimal local staff. We need whatever we need somebody to open the curtain. And then we need the person who's a sound engineer, and then they'll usually have a master carpenter, master electrician who's on deck. And usually there's more people sitting around than anything else because a lot of the theaters will have, a minimum, a skeleton crew. And we're not trying to take jobs away from people. We just don't have time to rehearse these shows with them, and we create them in such a way that we don't have to. So anyway, Rachel and Wes would be happy to kind of talk, to get you set up with anything you want with that. And just to speak to your point about the engineering thing, um, it's kind of a cool thing that we do. We do a lot of engineering universities, and I think that's in large part due to the fact that the content is something that is. It's not like one of these things where, like, I mean, we do school shows for kids too, and like this the stuff that is out there that purports to be educational or to school shows is kind of ridiculous. And our stuff, we have a study guide that's 40 pages long, with everything from like the history in the case of Zephyr, with the history of where the name comes. Zephyr is Zephyros, this ancient word for gentle breeze,
Right.
to the windmill and what it does, and the fact that these things were used for irrigation and to make flour, because kids don't always know that. And then we also have stuff in there that talks about gear ratios, and the ratio of weight depending on whether we move the fulcrum over by a foot, and that suddenly that girl that weighs 100 pounds now weighs 450 pounds. That's essentially what it is now. It's about 4.25 to 1 in terms of her weight on this side. So if we want to change the apparatus, and she's hanging by her hair, so there's no apparatus. But if I suddenly want to put an aerial hoop out there that weighs 30 pounds, then I need to add 120 pounds on the other side of that thing. That's not, it's not super, it's not technical, but from people who study engineering, it's interesting because it's a visual interpretation. It's a visual explanation of a lot of stuff that is just in theory. And the funny thing for us that I find, and it's true of, I think, in every walk of life, is there's no substitute for experience and for the nuts and bolts for doing it, right? These things that are theoretical become much more interesting when you actually when you have to do them, which is why, of course, people build models and things like that, right? We have people that just, I asked people when I was building the gantry bike, figuring out how to climb that bicycle. I asked an engineering friend of mine, I was like, so I need to find out, like, what gear ratio am I gonna need? Like, how much force is it gonna take on those pedals to be able to climb that bike? And he did some math, right? Math is great, but it was like, he came back with like, it's gonna require 270 foot-pounds of torque to lift, right? And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Like, that's great if you're speccing that lift for a motor that has the specs right here that says it lifts 400 pounds, creates 400 pounds of torque or has this much horsepower. But the human body doesn't have ratings like that. Your rating and my rating are different, let alone, right? So like translating the mathematical stuff is an art form, right? Understanding what the hell that means. What is that 400? Like, what? That's useless to me. Like, I understand that that's the way that system works, but we have to then adapt that language to the language of the physical body. And I think that the people in engineering can appreciate that. Some of this stuff is a little bit nerdy, but it's always visually interesting, or else, right? Or else we're dead, because it's like, we can't just create this stuff because we think it's cool if it doesn't resonate.
Very well spoken, and I'm intrigued by it as a grown person, as excited as I was as a child, looking through how it works, and it's, I'm not going to say in these times, but there is a certain disconnect between how things work, so being able to show that, I hope it got some resonance, and I really appreciate your time again, and I appreciate that we might not get to meet in person for the show here, but it's going to be interesting to see. We'll stay out of the way naturally. It's a very grand room if you haven't been there before, the Moss
We've
Arts
been,
Center.
yeah.
And it's got a few balconies and it's large size, and so it'll be a really good looking
Yeah,
spot.
I don't think I don't know if you have a relationship with the venue, but we get comps, so I don't, if they're not spoken for, I can connect you guys if you want, if you want to see the show, if you don't have tickets already.
We're actually
They're a big sponsor and advertiser for us, so
They
we
take
really
care of you
enjoy
then.
covering their work. You know, this is a very exciting. You're actually following up. Wynton Marsalis is playing there
Cool.
2 weeks before, so it's
Right on.
it's a good look for Blacksburg town, and all that educational elements. All those elements you describe are truly intriguing. So I want to thank you for taking the time again, Chris.
Of course. Yeah, no problem. Good talking to you both.
Yeah, be
I have to figure out how to send you this link because it's on the cloud.
okay.
So I'm gonna figure that out. Because I'm not like of our groups that meet and do all this. I hear it being recorded all the time and I have no idea what happens to it. I just get a link. So I'll just send a message to a friend of mine and figure out how to get you this link.
All right, you got the email there. Be in touch if anything else comes to mind you care to add. And I wish you a good day at the shop there. Start the
Will do.
new year. Las
Thank
Vegas.
you. Cheers,
Thank
guys.
you.
Nice talking to
Cheers.
you. Bye.